Before I even get into any content, I just want to put out a request, which is that we are looking for veterans who have had questionable experiences in community substance use residential care. So if you yourself or you know someone who's had a very questionable experience of any sort, and you can contact me. I put my email earlier in the Zoom. You can do it through the hosts as well who know how to reach me. But we're just looking for individuals, and then we can take it from there in terms of how that might be useful. Um, and I'll say a little bit more about why that is going to be useful in a second. But just want to start with that request. The other thing I think is worth saying, that's a through line for Suzanne, for Bruce, for myself, for our organization, is that we fundamentally believe that if community care is unchecked in terms of the amount of care that is farmed out to community care and the dollars that travel with it, that at some point it is going to kind of bleed out the possibility that the VA can exist in its current form. And so one of the values that I think we all share is that we think that the VA is an institution, a system, really, that has plenty of blemishes and flaws, but it's really irreplaceable. And that when it's gone, there will be nothing, it won't come back, and what will replace it won't really be in any measure kind of what the VA has been and could be if we protect it. And so I think a lot of what we say and do has that as a premise. And some of my comments in a moment when I'm going to talk about Congress really come from that. Um, there are two reasons that that's come up as an issue at this point. One obviously is the kind of dramatic assault that Suzanne was just alluding to. Um, but when the Choice Act passed in 2014 and then the mission in 2018, a lot of people were lulled into believing that you could have your cake and eat it too. And they were deliberately lulled into it because it was extra money that Congress kept forking over right from the get-go, right from the Choice Act itself, that gave the pretense that the VA could be fully staffed and fully resourced, and you could also have the community care to your heart's content, and there was actually no competition for resources between the two. And that went on for a number of years, and I think one of the reasons that people were slow to have any reaction to community care is it looked initially like there was no downside to it. This was just an added bonus. What we started writing about actually in 2016, and then now that we're in our ninth year doing, is saying that eventually has to stop. And actually, it did stop about a year ago, when all of a sudden now we're seeing many policymakers, both proposing bills, but many other advocates outside of actual congressional legislation, we're saying that community care should be paid for out of the VA's pocket rather than in addition to the VA's pocket. It would be out of the pocket, and that this then will lead to some tipping point that if we're not over it yet, we're certainly at a tipping point where there's a kind of downward spiral, that money that comes out of the VA and into the community ultimately reduces resources, ultimately reduces programs, personnel, units, and so forth. And there's very little justification for maintaining the system as it exists. I think at a core level, kind of a lot of what we endeavor to do in our organization is to see that never happens. And I think we will continue that fight to the bitter end. I think Project 2025, which we're only beginning to see more of taking shape now, has that process in its mind. A core piece of what's in Project 2025 says that resources ought to go into VA community-based outpatient clinics. That should be taken out of medical centers, inpatient units, emergency rooms, that the funding there should shift it first internally in the VA and ultimately out into the community care program. And I think that one of the things we have to be careful about is that within this administration that we see more money going out to the community that ultimately leads to decisions that certain VAs are not worth saving. At this point, they all still exist, all 170 medical centers. And it's important to protect that for many reasons that we may not even get into here, but maybe we'll in the question and answer later. I just also want to make one other additional comment from what Suzanne was saying about how can you fire 83,000 employees and still maintain the same health benefits. I think if you read between the lines, I think what is meant by that is all veterans who are eligible for care and health care will get them. But I think what is meant is, but you won't get them at the VA. That is kind of the unspoken piece about why you can continue to get all your benefits because it's not promised at the VA anymore. And I think that is what is meant. And obviously, nothing's been revealed yet about where those 83,000 are. But actually, pay attention to what Secretary Collins is saying at different places that he's giving interviews because he's beginning to demonstrate where he thinks there is so-called fraud, waste, and abuse, which will, at least it will be claimed that that is, those are the programs and those are the personnel that he can see where there could be cuts. My task actually today, I don't think anyone except Bruce and Suzanne and I had this agenda, was just to talk about what's happening in Congress. So I'm going to kind of pivot here. Um, but I just want to say one other thing also in keeping with what Suzanne's saying, which is that the resistance to what has happened in the first couple of months in the new administration, the tip of the spear has been about veterans employment and veterans benefits. And so that really dovetails with kind of what we've been doing for the last 8.5 years. Um, but Suzanne was talking about, the number of requests for interviews, the number of articles that are appearing, and so forth and so on, is that the resistance is with this issue, which I think gives everybody on this call and all your compatriots a lot more potential power, if we keep this on the front page. And like Suzanne was saying, is that I think proactivity at this point is likely to have continued success. And that has to do with demonstrations, it has to do with news articles, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Congress here. There's one particular bill that we are extremely worried about. It's the Veterans Access Act. Sadly, it has been endorsed by most major veteran service organizations. We don't have to get into kind of how that happened necessarily here, but just, other than to say that makes it have more potential in Congress to feel like it's got veteran support and therefore to get smooth sailing later. But the Veterans Access Act, if you drill down, has one particular buried component to it in Section 302, if you want to look, which proposes a pilot in which veterans would no longer need VA's permission or authorization or referral for mental health care and substance use disorder care in the community for outpatient care. This is something that, in spite of how difficult Mission Act has been for kind of undermining the VA, the one thing the Mission Act said and did is the VA would still always remain the authorizer of care. And the system is actually built on that one premise. There's a pilot in the Access Act that says we're going to start with at least 5 sections of the country. We're going to start with a mental health and substance use disorder, and we're going to start for 3 years as a so-called pilot. And then after 3 years, the VA is instructed to figure out what are the impediments to making it kind of completely universal for all healthcare conditions across the entire country. And if and when that happens, that's the ball game, because that is essentially the same as issuing insurance cards to veterans to go get your own care, and the VA's only involvement at that point is paying the bill. It completely upends the entire model on which everything good in the VA that is good is predicated. And so we've been very strongly opposed to that section of the bill. If it's not modified, then the whole bill itself. But it is a Trojan horse easily in terms of the way it's constructed. At this point in time, both the House and the Senate Veterans Affairs Committees have had initial hearings on the bill, and neither have gone to markup. In both the Senate and the House, they are waiting for a CBO score on the Access Act before they do any more. If there's one thing that I would make requests of those of you on the call, if you haven't already done so, to please write your members of Congress and indicate the concern that you have that this pilot actually would quickly bleed out the VA and really upend it in terms of what you're. If you favor the VA, you can't actually favor this pilot. There should be no pretense that a pilot is only a pilot and people use data from the pilot to actually make improvements. And if it's failing, that they actually abolish it. There's no evidence that Congress does that. I mean, if you go back even to the Choice Act not only was a pilot, it was a sunset legislation that, as was written, was supposed to catch up on everybody who was on wait lists within 3 years and extra resources, and then it was supposed to sunset and go out of business. Within a month after it passed, John McCain, who was one of the authors of it, said, if I said sunset, I actually meant permanent. And that was probably true. That there's no reason to think that pilots really do sunset. They actually are just the foot in the door for something that's permanent. So my emphasis about what's happening, that's at the kind of red alert in terms of what's happening in Congress. There's a couple other pieces of that legislation that should be of concern. One is the way in which it gives veteran preference now as a new criteria for eligibility for community care. We're really not a fan of that because that's a very slow bleed, but it's nowhere near kind of as rapid as the piece that I was talking about just a couple minutes ago. There's one other section in that bill that I'll just mention, which has to do with new ways of monitoring residential rehabilitation treatment programs in the community for mental health and substance use. There's an opportunity in that section of the bill, if Congress had the guts, to have the same criteria for the ways in which quality control happens in the VA to be applied outside. In spite of the fact that the Mission Act talked about quality, I counted them 50 times. It's a bill that supposedly had to do with quality in the community and access to the community. In the 6 years since the Mission Act has been in play, it's been access, access, access all the time, and actually deliberately, until very recently, not a single mention of any quality measures that are expected from community care. So not only do you kind of have more veterans being farmed out, but you have a system in which no quality measures are being applied for that care. And community care is going to be around forever. No matter what happens in terms of legislation, that's not going away. So one of the things that we have to do is to put pressure on Congress to have quality standards be applied, and ideally the same quality standards that are applied to the VA be applied to the community. So that would be another ask as well. So lastly, I just want to say that members of Congress, they are responsive to contact. Do it often, and do it again.